So this lecture is just give you a bit of background on Glycan, on all the possibilities of Glycan use, and in particular for archaeological conservation, which is a bit more of an unusual use. So I'm just going to go into a little bit background on the artifacts that form the main basis of the research, and then into chitosan use in cleaning wastewater. It'll tie back in, and then the results from analytical ultrasoundification for the chitosan and aminocellulose, which were the focus of this, and then a little bit of the results of the wood treatment and the development of organic soluble treatment, and then into other uses of polysaccharides in medicine and for packaging material. And again, this will tie back in, and then into cellulose for archaeological wood conservation, and then future work for textile research. So the Osberg artifacts are a collection of wooden artifacts from a Viking ship burial. They're a very important collection. There's not very many collections as big as this from the Viking Age, particularly of wooden artifacts. So, and these are so intricately carved as well. So they form a very important collection. Organic artifacts obviously degrade very quickly, so they're rarely found in the archaeological record. So having a collection as big as this can give us a lot of information about the Viking Age. So this collection was discovered in 1903, excavated in 1904, and the conservation started in 1905. The conservator at the time went all around Europe trying to find the best possible conservation method, and it appeared to be alum. The theory is the salt crystals form inside the wood, and that stops it shrinking, cracking, and warping as it dries, which it did. However, to get it soluble, it was heated up to 90 degrees to help it dissolve. And once it cooled, the treatments were put into this bath. However, the high temperature and also the 100 years since the treatment has produced a lot of sulfuric acid, and at this point it's degraded pretty much all the cellulose and to some extent the lignin in the wood as well. So although the artifacts look in very good condition from the surface, they're not actually in as good condition as they appear. As soon as a piece breaks off, you can see it's like powder on the inside. So they're in desperate need of a method of conservation. You might question as to why not use an existing consolidant? What are the problems with the existing consolidants? So the Mary Rose and the Vasa are prime examples. So the Mary Rose is one of the flagships of King Henry VIII, and I recommend going down to the museum down in Portsmouth. They don't just have the ship itself, but they've got a whole range of artifacts that were found alongside it, including a little spool with an individual thread, and I felt that was absolutely amazing that had been preserved at the bottom of the sea for all these years. But there's a whole range of artifacts that tell a lot about the life at the time, and particularly the life on a warship. But the problem in terms of the conservation, this is slightly different because it wasn't treated with alum, but it was found at the bottom of the sea rather than from a burial. And because of that, there's hydrogen sulfide from bacteria in the wood. And when that came up to the surface, it's produced sulfuric acid. And that, again, has caused similar issues to the Osberg collection. Additionally, these were all treated with PEG, and it was sprayed for about 19 years, and it's been drying for a long time since, and I believe it's now dry. And it's generally given very good results, the treatments of PEG. The ship was treated with PEG 2000 and then 4000, and similarly, the artifacts were treated with PEG as well. However, when it comes to composite objects, such as this cannon, you've got a mixture of metal and wood. The iron corrodes the peg. The peg produces acidic breakdown products that then corrode the iron, and it forms a vicious cycle. So it's a serious problem in conservation, and the last conference I went to, there was a lot of discussion about these composite artifacts and the problems that that has resulted in. So we're looking for a natural consolidant that would ideally help in cases where there's iron as well. There's less in terms of the Osberg collection, but there are still some items that are composite objects as well. Even if it's just one small nail or something, it does affect the conservation. This will tie back in. So chitosan is something that's used for wastewater treatment. So there's a whole bunch of pollutants in water, and they cause serious health issues, and particularly heavy metals. So there's a need to try and clean water. And chitosan is one of the things that's been readily investigated because it's a waste product from the canning industry, so it's sustainable, readily available, and cheap. And chitosan is just a deacetylated form of this chitin. So the reason this chitin works is because of that NH2 group. It's able to chelate metal ions, as you can see here. So iron oxide is one of the things that's been investigated to bind to. And there's heaps of ways to use chitosan. It's used as sort of flotation to let sediment to try and take out the metal ions, or it's been included in porous beads. But one of the interesting ways is, like I said, this metal oxide, because it can chelate to metal oxide, you form this sort of magnetic core with more chitosan on the outside, and that's able to bind to the heavy metals, and then you can use a magnet to get it all back out. Because the problem with flotation is being able to remove the iron again, and I thought this was a particularly interesting example. So that's how it ties back in. It's that ability to chelate metal ions that we're hoping will be particularly useful in archaeological conservation, stop the iron ions migrating through the wood and causing further issues. So, like I said, it's sustainable and it's cheap, can chelate metal ions. It's similar to cellulose, and we're hoping that would help with the binding to the wood to give it more strength. It's more acid stable than cellulose. And you can get low molecular weight versions, all of which will get help with the treatment of the archaeological wood. So I'm just going to do a brief background into analytical ultracentrifugation. I'm sure Steve's already told you all about this, and I'm sure he's described it as a giant washing machine. And the centrifugal force forces the molecules to sediment outwards. So pictures I've got here are just a cross section across that cell. So it's sedimenting outwards towards that cell base. And that sedimentation is based on the shape and the molecular weight. So obviously, if it's got greater weight, it's going to sediment faster. But the shape affects the buoyancy and therefore the sedimentation as well. If you've got a larger shape, it's going to struggle to move through the solution more, resulting in slower sedimentation. So it's got both aspects in terms of sedimentation, but it's very good for giving you a distribution of the polymer in terms of different molecular weights. However, like I said, it's based on two factors. Sedimentation equilibrium, on the other hand, is run at a slower speed and waits for equilibrium to be reached between the sedimentation and the back diffusion, and that gives you the molecular weight. And the advantage of that compared to gel permeation chromatography is it's based on first principles. Gel permeation chromatography, it very much depends on the standard. If you've got a good standard and it's similar to the standard, then it can give you a very, very good approximation. However, if your standard isn't appropriate, then it puts into question the reliability of the results. Whereas this is based on first principles. But it takes a lot longer to do the analysis, to do the experiment and the analysis as well. So chitosan had previously been researched for archaeological wood conservation as an earlier part of this project. but they'd had problems due to the concentration they were able to use. It forms quite a viscous solution, so they were down to 2 or 4%, and it wasn't enough to give consolidation of the artifacts. Well, the test treatments of wood. So I wanted to look at the molecular weight they had used to get an estimate of what molecular weights needed and why it may not have been successful. So they had a relatively tight distribution. It's a natural polymer. There's always going to be a fairly broad distribution. Low sedimentation weight coefficient and about a 14,000 molecular weight. So look to depolymerize this. So this was a method found in literature, which used hydrogen peroxide and UV light to depolarize the chitin. And it was possible to bring the molecular weight down from 14,000 to about 5,000. And depending how long you expose it to light, you could bring it down further. So we were going to test this initial 5,000, see what the results are. It seemed reasonable. And then if needed, we can bring the molecular weight down further. Like I said, we also need to know distribution because it's not just about the average molecular weight, but it's about that distribution range. And the original chitin had quite a broad distribution range, which explains why, despite being quite a low molecular weight at 10,000, it was still very viscous and it wasn't all going into the wood well. So depolymerizing it gave it an average of about 5,000, but as you can see, the entire range was brought below 10,000. Problem with aminocellulose, though, is it needs acetic acid to be able to dissolve it. So you're washing out all the acid of the wood, and then you're reintroducing acid. It's a little bit counterintuitive. And although it's not as acidic as the wood was initially, and it's especially with that buffering ability of chitin, it's more similar to the pH of natural wood, but it's still not ideal to be washing out acid and then reintroducing it. It is likely to cause some degradation in the future. So that's why we also looked into aminocellulose. So it's got a similar structure to cellulose, to chitin and cellulose, but instead of the NH2 group being here, you've got your NH groups here instead. And it's the same with this other one. So again, the idea is the NH2 group will help to buffer if there's an increase in pH decrease in pH later. Basically, if acidic breakdown products are produced, it has some buffering ability, and it's able to hopefully chelate the metal ions in the same way chitin is able to. And additionally, it's known to self-associate, which, if it does this inside the wood, could really help give it some more strength. So we wanted to check the self-association ability and determine the monomeric molecular weight of aminocellulose, so the two that we were investigating. So it's a little hard to see here, but as the loading concentration increases, so you're getting a more and more concentrated solution, so they're interacting more, where you've got self-association, when there's that big increase in concentration, you're going to get more and more higher molecular weight species as more and more bind together. So you can see this peak decreases and these high molecular weight peaks increase. It's not very clear in this sample, but it's more clear on the next one. And the average for the molecular weight from the sedimentation equilibrium is given here. But what we were more interested in is the monomeric molecular weight. So if you look at along the cell, you've got it's getting more and more concentrated towards the cell base, which is what that bottom axis is, and you've got the molecular weight changing as you go down the cell. Sorry, that's not right. You've got the molecular weight as you're going down the cell, is what I was trying to say. So if you extrapolate back to zero concentration, which is along the cell, if you extrapolate back to zero concentration, that gives you the monomeric molecular weight. So you're plotting back the concentration from across that cell, sorry, the molecular weight, to determine at zero concentration along that cell what it would be. And that gives you about 5,000. And just briefly, I just want to point out what was wrong with this structure. It's missing the drawing. It's missing the brackets and the degree of polymerization. If you've got a polymer, you always need to show the brackets to show that is a polymer and not just one unit. So this one's been done correctly. So again, here you're seeing that self-association as it's getting more and more concentrated. You're getting more and more high molecular weight species. And again, it's plotting that concentration and with the molecular weight to extrapolate down to zero concentration. So along the cell, you've got more and more concentration because you've got higher and higher molecular weight species. And then towards the end, lower concentration, but you've got your lower molecular weight species. And you're extrapolating back to that to determine the monomeric molecular weight. And you can see there's some extrapolation. There is some overlap, is what I'm trying to say. Sorry, there's some overlap at different loading concentrations with the initial increase in molecular weight. And that shows that it's a reversible system. And it's not, this overlap is particularly clear, and that higher concentration is likely due to non-ideality, that deviation. But you can see there's a perfect overlap initially, and that shows a reversible system. And same here. There is a bit of variability in AUC, but it is still overlapping. If you see a system that's not overlapping, they're completely different. So both of these have a similar monomeric molecular weight to chitosan. So they're going to be comparable. This is just another way to determine the monomeric molecular weight. If you plot these N average, weight average, and Z average, they'll all converge to the same monomeric molecular weight at low concentration, giving the monomeric molecular weight. On to the treatment initially of artificial wood and then archaeological wood. So we don't want to risk treating the Osberg artifacts right away. You want to initially treat wood samples that are artificially degraded, and then archaeological wood, and then eventually onto treatment of the objects if it's appropriate. So the archaeological wood, there's a fairly limited supply. It's from trees that happen to have fallen down at a similar time at an archaeological site, or sometimes if you've got old railway sleepers and things like that, you've got some items like that have no big archaeological importance. Once they're recorded, they're no longer required. Those are the sort of samples that make good test pieces, but there is still quite a limited supply of them. So initially we looked at artificially degraded wood. So this was wood treated with acid and base, back and forth to depolarize the polymers inside to degrade the wood. And then it was washed and dried, ready to use as test pieces. So we looked at 10% chitosan and 5% aminocellulose because they were more viscous. And initially for the artificial degraded wood, we also looked at 2% of the first aminocellulose as well. And then after that, we decided that 2% isn't really sufficient for conservation to give it for consolidation, so we carried on with just the aminocellulose because that was given to us in a dry form, so we could make it into whatever concentration we wanted. The chitosan acetate salt, that was never expected to work, but it will give us an idea of the way it's working, whether that NH2 group is involved, because this is the salt version of the chitosan formed with acetic acid. So this is as well at pH 7, so it's got less issues, but it can disassociate again back into the acetic acid. And like I said, it's more to do with looking at the mechanisms. And then we looked at PEG with varying concentration, because the concentration you use is very much dependent on the level of degradation of the wood. So this is for the laboratory degraded wood. So this shows the volume increase and the weight increase. So you can see the aminocellulose and the chitosan did get into the wood. And considering they were based on lower concentrations, it's not a surprise that when you've got a higher concentration of PEG, you've got greater weight increase. But it did cross less volume increase, which is a positive thing. You don't want the wood to be swelling. For the archaeological wood, this was treated from wet instead, so we don't have the weight increase, but what we do have instead is the anti-shrink efficiency, and this is a standard way for investigating consolidants in conservation. So you look at how much a treatment prevents shrinkage in comparison to having it untreated. So you leave one piece just to air dry. Well, you always do it in triplicate, but you leave pieces to air dry and you see how much it shrinks. Then you compare how much the control is just water, but freeze-dried. So that's how much just the freeze-drying process prevents shrinkage. And then you've got your effective treatments on top of that. So you can see there's quite a range of how effective it was. So this gives the average with the standard deviation for the 3 pieces. And you can see all treatments did improve the anti-shrink efficiency, and you're looking for 100% anti-shrink, as in no shrinkage. Aminocellulose gave quite good results, but particularly the aminocellulose in combination with PEG gave the best results, and it gave less variability than PEG alone. And 40% PEG was just too high a concentration for this wood, and it ended up with significant swelling. So what I wanted to show here is just to show you what the wood looked like after treatment. So this is the control. So this is what you're comparing these photographs to, and this is before treatment. So this is to look at the volume change between each one. You can see it's not significant. And in terms of color change, the 40% PEG is lightening a little bit, but the other treatments aren't causing too much change, although there's a slight darkening with the aminocellulose. We also wanted to look at consolidation. So looking to initially just at the surface consolidation. So looked at using a simple tape test, so just putting a bit of tape on the surface of the wood and peeling it off and seeing how much powder comes off. So we did this in a quantitative way, looking at the weight removed. However, with the treatments, there were some cases where barely any pieces were removed. Great. It shows that there's good surface consolidation, but there were other pieces where you ripped it off and a big chunk was removed. So it is consolidating, but the strength of the tape is then ripping it off the surface. So I wanted to differentiate between that very fine powder, but a lot of it, to big chunks being removed. So there's a qualitative assessment from 1 to 5, ranked from 1 to 5, depending on whether it was fine powder or big chunk. And we looked at these in combination to really assess what the surface consolidation was like. So you can see with the aminocellulose gave very good results, and same with the chitosan. And the PEG actually didn't give as good results for the 20%. We also wanted to confirm that the treatments were in the wood, so we had a look at doing IR to see if we could see if the treatment was in there. And with PEG it's possible. You can see the PEG got in right to the very center of the wood pieces. However, in terms of the aminocellulose, it is just too similar to the cellulose naturally in the wood to really differentiate whether or not there's any present. And it's the same with the chitosan and chitosan acetate. You can't really be sure whether or not it's in there. We had a look at SEM as well to see if we could identify it. And it's the same issue. We suspect it's coating the edge of the cell wall, which is why it's not visible in any of the SEMs. But what we can see is an open structure is maintained. There's been a big push in conservation a few years ago to have reversible consolidants. And this is because there's a whole range of historical treatments that are now causing problems, such as the alum, but other consolidants as well. So there's a push to have consolidants that you're able to remove. However, what they found in practice is, although they've looked at a whole bunch that can be removed, that removal is more theoretical than in practice, because often you need to re-immerse it to be able to wash it out. You're having to interfere with the object a lot. It's very intensive to try and remove a treatment. Sometimes you're having to use warm water as well, so you have a lot of risks involved with a retreatment. So what we're looking at this is, instead of something that's reversible, what was more important for us is for it to be retreatable, because no consolidant's going to last forever. So you're either going to have to remove it and retreat it, or if we can just retreat it without removing it, that could be of benefit. So that's what we were looking for. And you can see an open structure is maintained, so you can easily add in another consolidant without having to remove the aminocellulose. The PEG, it's a little hard to see here, it's more clear at 40%, but it sort of just clogs inside all the cells, and that's what's giving it some strength, whereas the aminocellulose we're suspecting coats the cell walls. And it's the same here with the chitosan. You can see a very open structure is maintained. The chitosan acetate is interesting. We suspect that it's sort of bound to the cell walls and sort of became detached, because we're not seeing that in any of the other ones. But you can see there's often two bits, one inside and one sort of another bit, one outside, and then sort of another bit inside the cell. And I suspect that's the acetate. It's not been able, it's sort of attached to the cell wall, and as it dries, sort of became detached. As I was slicing up the wood for SEM, I hadn't originally planned to take these photographs, but just sort of thought as I went along, oh, maybe it might come in useful. I hadn't actually planned to use these photographs. But as I saw it, I was sort of slicing it off to get a perfectly level surface for the SEM. Notice a big difference while cutting it for the different consolidants. So I ended up keeping the photographs. There is quite a lot of dust in some of them because I did saw through it first. But you can see there's quite a lot of variability in the controls, but also there's quite a lot of dust crumbs produced from cutting it. It shows just how fragile it was. With the aminocellulose, this one in particular, I saw that it took the photograph, and it only afterwards I should have really pushed all the dust clear and just shown the slices. But you can see there are some slices formed. You are able to sort of flake it off. The chitosan and salt, as you'd expect, is just crumbs. It's not really giving it any consolidation. The chitosan in acetic acid, it's sort of curled up, so it was forming sheets, so there is some consolidation there. The aminocellulose and PEG gave the best results. It was very, very clean sheets you were able to cut off. It consolidated very well, and actually, in fact, better than the PEG. And the PEG is dependent on the concentration. You can see again some sheets forming here, and with the 40% as well, but the 10% was not really sufficient to help with the conservation. So despite 5% aminocellulose and 10% chitosan, it did produce better results than equal concentration of the PEG. We wanted to look at at the consolidation and to see if it had given the wood back some strength that's been lost. And I went to a conference, and this is why you should go to conferences. You always get great ideas at conferences, and it is always the cutting edge of research. There was someone using a fruit spectrometer to look at wet archaeological wood to identify how degraded it was. And I was wondering if the same thing could be done to identify how much strength a treatment had given back to a piece of wood. However, this didn't work. Still go to conferences, but this particular idea was not successful. There was too much variability in the untreated wood to be able to determine really the effective treatment. You can see the wide range of variability here, so you can't be sure what this meant, and it wasn't to do with the starting material. So I wanted to plot that against density, so to see if there was any greater separation, but you can see the wide range of variability. And therefore, I would be hesitant to say that any of this is definitely due to the conservation treatment. I mean, obviously the increase of density is, but whether that increase of force is, I wouldn't be so sure. There's just too much risk that it's due to variability. With only 3 controls, we don't really know the range within the sample, and we can see it's very broad. The only one I would maybe see improved it is the chitosan. Everything else, there was overlap. And this is why you can see very, very clearly this piece is in much better condition than this piece here. So there was a lot of variability in the wood samples. So we needed another way to investigate this. So we've decided to do the 3-point bend test. But that's not possible on the archaeological wood because they're only 2 centimeters and you need about 15 centimeters to be able to run a 3-point bend test. This is a sort of standard test done with mechanical testing and engineering. But you need bigger sample size. So we couldn't do that with the archaeological wood, so we looked into basilwood. It's got quite a low density, so we were hoping, and it's quite weak material, so we were hoping that with consolidants in there, we'd see more of an effect that if we were to use the birchwood that was originally used for the artificially degraded treatments. So we had a look at that, and the flexion module shows how flexible a piece is, and you can see, and we plotted that against the original density of the wood in each case. And you can see it correlates very, very well with density. But when you compare it to the water control, which has just been immersed in water and then freeze-dried, you can see even that's given it some more flexibility. There's a lower flexion modulus for the according density in each case. So then we compared the water treatment control to the treatments. And you can see there's a further improvement in flexibility. So that's showing that the treatments are bringing more flexibility to that wood. Except in the case of the 2% aminocellulose and 10% PEG. That seems to have done the opposite. But the rest of them, they seem to have given back some flexibility. Different way of approaching it, decided to do a survey. 8 people is not really enough for a survey, but it was who was available around the lab at the time. So it was conservators, other researchers, and someone leading the project as well. Everyone liked the PEG, and everyone disliked the control. But other than that, there was a lot of variation of what people liked. So I did break this down further into what aspects people liked as well to try and narrow it down. I'm not going to go through all that, but I just wanted to give you a broad idea of other things to sometimes look into. It's worth getting other people's opinions rather than just looking at your own ideas. Particularly in conservation is subjective to what you're using it for, and I wanted to know what conservators and other people thought of the results rather than just looking at the numbers as well. Additionally, wanted to look at a few extra concentrations, because sometimes it is dependent on the concentration. I was wondering if we increase the concentration of aminocellulose, if it would give it some more strength. It did not. I think because the viscosity is then increased, less is possibly getting into the wood and therefore isn't actually improving it in comparison to the 5% solution. There was enough time to then go down. Maybe 4% would be better. I don't know, 4.5. There wasn't time to do that work. And looked at a different variation of aminocellulose and PEG. But again, this didn't particularly look to improve it either. So, but it's always worth trying variations. But this was done at the very end of my project, so there was only a few more variations I had time to look at. Moving on to aqueous, you may have noticed a flaw in all this plan. I said there's a lot of alum in the wood, and I'm talking about aqueous treatments that's going to wash it all out. And I mentioned how fragile the wood was, and you're maybe starting to piece two together. Yeah, there is a risk that if we wash out the alum, that it's just going to collapse. And it has looked at, there's quite a wide range of how fragile pieces are in the collection. There are some that are incredibly fragile, and there are some that are in better condition. So the ones that are in better condition could support a PEG treatment. And there were some test pieces done, and they seem to be able to support that. However, with the ones that are very fragile, there was a test piece put in, and it did just disintegrate. So we need both an aqueous option and a non-aqueous treatment option as well. So this here is a very, very brief summary, and not all the information for the non-aqueous treatment. So again, we started with chitosan, and we made a salt version of it with the methylfolinic acid, and that was just to allow the dilution of it to be able to add this TBDMS group. So that helped with, it was a method that was found in literature, so I wanted to see if it was possible with our particular molecular weights, and then investigate it for the consolidation. So it did help with solubility, but I did find the solubility was dependent, it appeared to be on the degree of substitution. But before spending time sort of changing the degree of substitution, I wanted to be sure how effective it would be on the wood. And if it gave great results, then we can fiddle with the degree of substitution. And if it didn't, then we wouldn't. So we were looking ideally for it to be soluble in ethyl acetate or isopropanol. I think the degree of substitution would affect whether or not it was soluble in ethyl acetate to a greater extent. Found it was completely soluble in toluene. Ethyl acetate, it precipitated out after a little while, but with the addition of toluene, it was fine. So we used a mixture in the end. We have the fume cupboards accessible, but in terms of if this was to continue, it's museum dependent whether or not they have fume hoods for that sort of treatment. So we would really be looking for ethyl acetate, just in terms of safety for the conservators. If ethyl acetate is an option, it would be a better option. It can still be done in a fume hood, but it's just a generally safer option. So looked at that, and for the degree of substitution, that can be determined from the NMR. So this is the NMR here. This is the backbone of the chitosan, and you can see this group, this hydrogen group is apart, and you compare the ratio of that, because you can't determine it very clearly here, and integrate that in comparison to the integration of these TBDMS groups, and that gives you the degree of substitution. And then the IR again was just to confirm that TBDMS group had been added, and the experiment was successful. Then we wanted to determine the molecular weight. Now, based on the the density of the solvent and the buoyancy of the molecule, it didn't seem likely that it was going to properly be able to sediment. And there's some issues depending on solvents with cells as well. So we decided to look at the original Kitesan and look at the average degree of polymerization and then compare that to the intermediate, which is that mesylate salt. And it was an acid treatment and in high concentration. So it did depolymerize the backbone to some extent. So we've got a lower degree of substitution. And then we just accounted for that weight increase with that TPDMS group. So multiplied it back up with the weight of that monomer unit with the TPDMS group to give you the molecular weight of the TPDMS Kitesan. So it's a higher molecular weight, but it's still got quite a small degree of substitution to it, a small degree of polymerization, so it should be able to get into the wood. That silica group came in very handy because remember how before we couldn't prove that it was coating to the edge of the cell walls? We can now. So you can see that it's coating the edge of the cell walls. So this is an EDS-SEM, energy, gotten the acronym, sorry, gone blank, but it gives you the elements on top of your SEM image. And that's able to show you where the silica is and therefore where the Kitesan is. And it is binding to the edge of the cell as we had suspected. So that was really interesting to see, and it was really nice to be able to prove that aspect. However, we did find when we were cutting the wood for the SEM and just handling it, although it did help consolidate it, it was quite brittle. So it's not really an option for archaeological conservation, despite giving some good results. The fact that it's quite brittle would be problematic. So I'm not going to bore you with all the results of that because like for the aqueous treatment, we've got all the same results for that. So I'm not going to go into that. And we'll move on for now. So that was a short break, so I'll just skip past that and that. So what else can Kitesan and polysaccharides be used for? So we talked about water purification already, but also its uses in biomedical for wound healing and drug delivery, and also for food packaging and in cosmetics as well. So medicinal uses of Kitesan. Kitesan and alginate together. Kitesan is cationic and alginate anionic, so they bind well, and they can be used to form capsules or tablets to include drugs, and it affects the release of the drug. So a low pH in the stomach, the drug isn't released, and it can be released at a higher pH, for example, in the intestines. So this was bovine albumin that was used just to test that theory. And it shows that you can have a controlled release. And there are some drugs that you want specifically to be delivered to the intestine because it maybe wouldn't cope with an acidic environment, or to increase the uptake, or to give a specific delivery for, say, cancer. Then you can have it, particularly if there's colonic cancer, you can deliver it directly to the intestines. Onto wound healing, another really interesting use. These are very random, but I just thought they were really interesting examples. So one example of its use is in wound healing. And you can see after 19 days, there's much better healing rate with the Kitesan used as a hydrogel to put on top of the wound to promote healing. And you can see from these pictures as well, you've even got the fur growing back after 19 days. The other thing you can do is add in additives to improve the antibacterial properties, and that was what was done in this case. And it works by having an antibacterial property covering it, so you're preventing more bacteria getting in, but also promotes the body to produce cells and send cells there that are antibacterial and help get rid of the bacteria, but also that help with the healing as well. So another aspect of completely different field for the use of chitosan is in for films and for packaging. And so bioplastics, there's been a big push towards moving away from fossil fuels and plastics into bioplastics. And there's been a fair amount of research into chitosan for this, as well as cellulose. And QTech is a company here in the UK who started researching it to be able to develop it for industry. And it's been researched for, I don't think it's on the market yet, but it's being researched predominantly for seafood. And I think they've said they've had some interest from Waitrose for covering for smoked salmon. So they're developing these sort of thin films for packaging. This is just to show you just how clear it can be, and very thin. And another use has been on coatings for fruit to try and reduce wastage of fruit, to try and prolong the shelf life. So you can see it gives better results than some other treatments and better than the control. So it prolongs the shelf life. So it's an edible coating. Chitosan can be eaten. So when you've got a thin coating on fruit like that, it can help prolong the shelf life directly on the fruit. Or alternatively, it can be investigated for packaging. So all these ones have chitosans with various additives to improve the flexibility of the films, for example. And you can see they all helped improve the shelf life after 16 days. They were in much better condition than the control. This is another example. Like I said, you can add in additives. So in this case, this has been done for food packaging, and they've added in thymol to give more antibacterial properties. And the other thing it does is it changes the water vapor permeability. And it initially increases it, and then it decreases with the thymol. So looking at the results, you can see that in comparison to the controls, the addition of the thymol really helps with the shelf life. However, you'll notice the highest concentration of thymol, it seems to have more fungal growth. And that is due to this water vapor permeability. You've got a decrease in water vapor permeability. So you're trapping moisture inside the container, and that is promoting growth. So you've got food and moisture in there, and you get growth. And this is something to bear in mind for archaeological conservation, because you do not want to risk there being bacterial and fungal growth on the artifacts. So it needs to be good water vapor permeability, not to end up with a buildup of moisture that would increase hydrolysis and bacterial and fungal growth and cause damage to your artifacts. So this is how it's sort of tying back in. Moving away from that for a second to freshness indicators. So I've said there's been a huge push towards biopackaging, bioplastics, but there's also been a push to decrease food wastage. There's a lot of food that's wastage. As soon as it goes past the sell-by date, it can't be sold. And the use-by dates are placed arbitrarily, and they tend to be a bit conservative. I'm sure with milk, you've been able to tell when it's off. Off milk is horrific. But in terms of other food, it can be much harder to tell if the food's off or not. So that's why the use-by dates are needed. And if you're going to remove them, there needs to be some other way to determine whether or not the food is off. And this is where these freshness indicators come in. They're basically pH indicators. So when something starts to go off, it can produce volatiles, and they tend to be acidic or more basic. So a pH indicator can give an idea of whether the freshness of the food. So there's a whole bunch of natural one from plants, and considering this is to be near in close contact with food, there's been preference as to looking to something that's already food grade. And there's heaps of things that are known to be pH indicators. For example, this butterfly plate is actually put in some teas. Bird and Blend do a lovely blue raspberry tea cocktail, and that has some butterfly pea in there, so it changes color. So you can have it as a cocktail or just as a cold brew. And I'm sure you may have also done the boiled up red cabbage water can also be used as a pH indicator, and that may be one that you've done in school. So again, like I said, just a whole variety of different ones have been investigated, not just the anthocyanins, but a whole bunch of other ones. And so you cast it, you form it, and you include that pH indicator in it. And what's being done now is to be able to read it on a smartphone to tell the level of freshness and give the information, rather than using like pH paper and going, well, which color is it? Which one is it lying under? So they're now including smartphones as well into the research. So there's a whole bunch of natural compounds that do this, and you can see the broad range of color possibilities. And there's been some research into looking at the two and using it for research as well. I've not known any of these to be on the market yet. There's a lot of research in terms of reducing food waste, but it's also useful purely for research purposes as well. So one of them is looking at chitosan with thymol to look at the shelf life and see if it improves the shelf life of prawns. And it's also used these indicators at the same time, showing that yes, it increases the shelf life, and that's proven through this pH indicator. Another aspect is UV protective films. So food can sometimes break down as well with UV light. It's not just bacteria and fungi that affects degradation. UV light can have damaging effects too, and particularly visually as well. And you can see the effects for this orange, although it does look more like every time I see it, I just think lines. And you can see this addition of this betel leaf extract, it completely reduces transmission between 200 and 400 wavelength, which is the UV light, but still has a great deal of transmission. And this is another example with another additive. You get a great deal of transmission, reduced UV transmission, but a great deal of transmission in the UV visible. So it's still clear, but it's able to block UV light. And it will give better perception to the consumers looking at the product. How does that tie back in? So in terms of the UV properties, UV degradation is big problem in museums. So museums often fill windows with films that block UV light, and you get special light bulbs to reduce UV light as well. But anything you can help to preserve the artifacts against UV light is beneficial. And in certain storage rooms, again, the storage rooms would be fitted with this if possible, but it depends on the finances of the museum as well. But also, if artifacts are taken out for research, it's also possible that for research that it's not always done. And that it's also that water vapor permeability, as I said. If you're going to put a film over to protect the artifacts from dust and UV light, you've got to also keep in mind that water vapor permeability, because you don't want to think you're protecting it and things that actually end up worse. So you do need to consider all the possible aspects, and it's great to get inspiration from other fields. So other uses of glycans in conservation is to remove stains. So in terms of sculptures, methyl cellulose poultices have been used to try and take away stains from pollution, and you can also add in chelating agents to help remove iron stains as well. So this is where there's been a leak, or possibly if you've got an iron nail that's caused damage as well. And Gellan gum has been used, you can see this as a workshop as well, to remove stains, and this shows the removal of a highlighter. And guar gum, you can see in this case, in this artifact, is managed to remove that marking from around the mouth. So it has produced very good results for stain removals for paper, for sculptures, for frescoes, and for mosaics. Nanocellulose films is something that's been investigated for paper conservation. So you can see it's transparent, so you'd still be able to read text under it for books, for conservation of books. And it transmits light very well for artwork conservation. You can barely see the aminocellulose repair of that paper, whereas traditionally Japanese paper, rice paper is used because it's very thin and transparent. And this is gami and kozo is and different sorts of paper that can be used. And you can see there can be color changes as well with light aging, whereas the methyl cellulose shows very little color change, which is another benefit of using it. And I just want to show some really amazing examples. So here you can see that there's a rip that was repaired, and you can barely see the repair. And this one with light coming from behind the painting, so you can barely see it. And again, you can barely see the repairs that have been done. It does an amazing job. And it can be applied with CoSalG, which is a hydroxypropyl cellulose, and it can be used with ethanol, so you're not wetting that that nanocellulose paper too much, and it's allowing it to be stuck on. And that hydroxypropyl cellulose that's CoSalG, is also used for as a consolidant as well. So for the Textract project, just briefly, these are the sort of artifacts we're looking at. So these are the textiles from that Osberg ship burial. And I just wanted to address the idea of what's important for an artifact. It's easy to assume that these artifacts with a lot more detail, and you've even got depictions here of a story scene. It's easy to assume that those are more valuable, but these scrap fragments, you can do analysis on the dyes, what fabric you use, where it was from, and get information on trade routes, which, yes, you could do with these nice pieces, but no conservator is ever going to let you do the analysis on these, because you would destroy the artifact, depending on the technique. But a lot of techniques that give you the most information are destructive, whereas this, a lot of information will be gained and not so much would be lost by doing the analysis. And this is an example of where it's been historically treated. So in some cases, it can be better to simply let it dry, particularly now that we can freeze dry samples, so it dries in a less destructive manner. But it is dependent on the condition of the artifact, what's most suitable. So in terms of analysis, you can check what material can be, what the material is. So this is similar to IR, but it's a non-destructive method of analysis, and you can determine what the material is, which is very important to know for conservation. It affects what consolidants you use. And you can also look at the dyes. So sometimes you can take a small fragment from the side or the edge or the back, depending on the situation with the textile. Or in some cases, it's even stained the paper, and you can analyze the paper or a small fragment that's fallen off. And again, knowledge of the dyes is incredibly important when it comes to textile conservation, because some of these dyes might work as pH indicators that we talked about later. So if you change the pH of the artifact, you may result in a change of color. That could change people's interpretations and perspective of the object as well. So we need to be very, very careful with consolidants, that it's not going to end up doing more harm than good. So that's why there's sometimes a need for preventative conservation. We might use films in some cases to try and protect as much as possible. Sometimes, particularly textiles are stitched onto linen backing that you could then very carefully cut away the stitches. So it's completely reversible, and it doesn't have anything actually going into the object, because that's the other thing with a consolidant. It can make it hard to do archaeological scientific research later when you've got a foreign material basically completely intermeshed with your original material. On the flip side, there's sometimes a need for consolidants where there's no other option, and you're likely to lose the textile. It's going to degrade, and there's not going to be a way to preserve it for next generations to see, to inspire next generations at museums. So it's dependent on the situation. You might look at a film to allow people to see it on display, or for research purposes, whilst blocking UV light and dust and leaks. You want it sort of waterproof, but still having that water vapor permeability to allow for not a buildup of moisture, but at the same time protect it from spills and still be completely clear for it to be able to view it. So depending on the situation, you might go towards preventative conservation, or if it's in really bad condition and it looks like it's continuing to degrade, may look at a consolidant treatment option. And there is a need to look at more sustainable options as well for conservation. There's a lot of waste in terms of packaging, and yeah, both consolidants and packaging, most of them are from fossil fuels. So there needs to be research now into more sustainable alternatives, so we're not throwing away so much plastic waste. And also when it comes to consolidants, when we do start to run out of fossil fuels, archaeological conservation is not going to be at the top of the list of what to use fossil fuels for. It will be medicine, not archaeological conservation, which is understandable. But it does mean we need to start researching it now. So there's multiple aspects to consider, but I hope this shows you all the possibilities with glycans. And I just want to also recommend the long Word document course as part of the graduate school short courses. It was recommended to me during my PhD, and I did find it very, very useful. They give you a lot of detail on how to format it exactly the way you would want it for your thesis or dissertation. So I recommend it for you if you have the opportunity to go. It would be great for your dissertations. If there should be multiple dates available, but if for some reason you don't have access and you're not able to book onto it, let me know, and I can maybe do a short run through to help you with your dissertations. Thank you very much.